Lille, a 1,000-year-old city in northern France, is just 15 kilometers from the Belgian border. The city features buildings from a variety of eras, some with ultra-modern architecture, others built more than 500 years ago. Among the monuments of Lille that have made a mark on history, 3 of them stand out and demonstrate the ability of men to push the limits of construction and are among the most emblematic of the capital of the North. The Citadel, the Vieille Bourse, and the Town Hall.
The Citadel of Lille is considered the queen of citadels.
It's said to be the largest construction site, along with the Palace of Versailles.
There's a before and after the Vieille Bourse when it comes to civil architecture.
Modernity appeared little by little, starting from this building.
The town hall had to be an emblem of the city, a landmark.
The tallest reinforced concrete building had to be built.
How were these imposing walls erected? On what mysterious proportions lies the harmony of the Vieille Bourse? What techniques gave shape to the reinforced concrete of the town hall?
There was a convergence of the top techniques of hydraulics and fortification.
The golden rectangle proportion is found in the building at all scales and in every detail.
The town hall is a glorification of concrete in every shape and form.
With its scale and the technical stakes involved, it is quite exemplary and exceptional.
Thanks to the greatest experts on the city's heritage, computer-generated reconstructions, and never-before-seen aerial shots, you are about to see how these buildings sprung out in Lille. This is the story of the construction of 3 of the most beautiful monuments in Lille, the fruits of the genius of visionary builders. Lille is the largest city in northern France. In its streets, the architecture reveals all its splendor and diversity. The rich houses of Old Lille stand alongside the modern facade of Notre-Dame de la Treille Cathedral. The brick belfry of the Chamber of Commerce meets the white stone of the Opera. All these buildings recall the economic, historical, and cultural influence of the city over the centuries. Lille, at the crossroads of roads and territories, was able to take advantage of its geographical location to prosper through trade. But this strategic positioning also made it a key military post, as evidenced by the imposing citadel that watches over it from the banks of the Dole River. With its walls nearly 10 meters high and its interior surface of 11 hectares, the equivalent of 15 soccer fields, it is by far the most monumental building in the city. But it's not just its size that makes it a key part of Lille. It's also that the story of its construction represents a shift in the history of the city, and more generally of France. In August 1667, Louis XIV's troops took Lille, which then belonged to the Spanish Netherlands. The city became a strategic lock on the border of the Kingdom of France, which had to be protected. Louis XIV entrusted 34-year-old military engineer Vauban with his first major construction. Nothing was too great for the young prodigy, who had to build a monument with enough power and magnificence to live up to the Sun King. But how was Vauban able to carry out this colossal project in record time? Indeed, the construction of the citadel was lightning fast. In barely a few months, the plans were validated by the king. Vauban deployed great means to create what he called the Queen of Citadels.
It is said to be the largest construction site, along with the Palace of Versailles. It was one of the major construction sites in Europe at the time.
He had to act quickly to build thousands of meters of walls, but also a small town capable of accommodating 2,500 men.
For 3 years, virtually all the energy in what was called Walloon Flanders at the time was focused on building the citadel. Vauban mobilized a tremendous number of human resources by organizing requisitions among the peasants, even mobilizing soldiers who turned into road workers. Eventually, almost 30,000 men worked either in the quarries or in the brick kilns to build the citadel.
In the winter of 1667, hundreds of workers, peasants, and soldiers began digging ditches in the cold. This was a huge challenge, given the means of the time.
Everything was still done in an artisanal way, meaning manually. The only driving force available was human strength or animal strength. The blocks of stone were hoisted thanks to treadwheel cranes, like in the Middle Ages. When ditches were dug, manual tools such as shovels and pickaxes were used to fill carts with earth that was later dumped to form the embankment of the ramparts.
In 6 months, the workers succeeded in the feat of drying the swampy soils and building the foundations of the citadel. But the most impressive remained to be done: erecting the monumental walls. A breach in the wall shows the amount of material that was necessary.
This wall consists of 2 parts: a thickness of about 80 centimeters of brick, a material that's easy to implement and relatively elastic with regard to the impact of cast iron cannonballs. It's a material that doesn't break into sharp pieces. The core of the wall is made of limestone rubble. Since this material isn't great at withstanding bad weather, it was simply laid out relatively roughly in order to form the core of the wall instead.
But the wall was not limited to this thick armor. Beyond these 80 centimeters of brick and the 3 meters of stone, there were still 3 to 6 meters of stone buttresses, then 10 to 20 meters of earth embankment and wood bundles. Carrying out these imposing works required a dizzying amount of material, which the builders were hard-pressed to obtain.
Not only did they have open quarries, but they had to buy old farms and castles and demolish them just to supply more stone to the site.
For 3 years, the entire production of materials was geared towards the construction of the Queen of Citadels, Vauban's masterpiece.
Between the walls of the citadel itself and the many defensive structures that surround it, 20 million stone blocks were used, along with 60 million bricks and 32 linear kilometers of sandstone blocks, the equivalent of the length of the Paris Ring Road. At the height of the work, a phenomenal number of 8,000 stone blocks were cut in the quarries daily. But how were they transported to the construction site?
Even from a few kilometers away, stones were brought in with carts pulled by oxen or horses. It was very expensive and slow.
There were very few paved roads at the time. Land routes were impassable during bad weather.
There was a great risk of falling behind, which would cause construction costs to explode. So Vauban ordered the creation of a waterway, which was more suitable for supply. A 2-kilometer-long and 16-meter-wide canal was dug between the quarries to the east of the city and the construction site.
This was a very important element because it changed the logistics and the cost of the project.
Thanks to the fantastic deployment of resources, Vauban succeeded in his bet. The monumental citadel of France emerged from the ground in record time.
5 years after the start of construction, which went on from 1667 to 1672, the citadel was completely operational. The enclosure was built, the barracks as well, all the buildings were there. Building such a fortress in 5 years was incredibly fast.
once in working order, this citadel was a ruthless war machine. All the more so that beyond its impressive size, it had a remarkable asset: its location. On a large part of the perimeter, it was surrounded by marshes, a natural barrier that was difficult for enemy troops to cross. But Vauban thought it wasn't sufficient and decided to strengthen it with a defensive flood system. To do so, he completely altered the water flow around Lille.
His major achievement was to make the citadel a lock. The waters of the Doubs were diverted to no longer cross the city, instead crossing the citadel.
Before the construction of the citadel, the Doubs River passed through the center of Lille. During its construction, Vauban built a canal under the citadel, the Vauban Canal, to divert the river to the north of the city. It was through this system that flooding was controlled. As soon as the canal was closed, the water rose. But the system was actually much more sophisticated than that. The expansion of the flood could be controlled in successive zones, thanks to a set of dikes and sluice gates. Some of the surrounding areas of the citadel could be flooded, while sparing others to allow access to a rescue army, for example, or to preserve market gardens that were essential to feeding the city. It was a remarkably complex and efficient defense system.
They could easily flood 1,700 hectares under 40 centimeters of water, so much so that an attacking army could no longer advance, set up camp, or launch an assault.
There was a convergence of the top techniques of hydraulics and fortification at the end of the 17th century.
Another benefit of the site was that to the east, the citadel was protected by the city itself. If the enemy army didn't want to get bogged down in the marshes to the west, then it had to attack through the city. But to do so, it first had to take the city, which was protected by ramparts. Any army would therefore reach the citadel only at the cost of heavy losses. And even if it succeeded, an even harder task awaited, as this type of fortification had proven efficient for more than a century.
Vauban took it upon himself to perfect the techniques that had first been implemented by Italian engineers at the beginning of the 16th century, at the time of the Italian Wars.
A bastion fortress is a war machine that's built to kill the enemy.
To defend Lille, Vauban chose a fortification with 5 points, known as bastions, on which soldiers and cannons are positioned.
Two of the bastions faced the city. That was enough for them to protect each other and the city as well. And on the other side, the remaining 3 bastions were angled in such a way that the enemy would be forced to attack them all at once. If only one was attacked, the other 2 would defend the one being attacked.
This bastion fortification elevated the art of war to perfection. From the strongholds, one could launch a remote defense by shooting cannons at the trenches of the enemy trying to approach. And in the event the enemy reached the foot of the walls anyway, it would inevitably fall to the pointed bastions.
One of the great advantages of bastion fortification, with all these angles everywhere, is that there are no blind spots. Once the enemy gets close to the walls, they're inevitably shot or hit by cannonballs.
And that's if the enemy made it to the walls at all. Before that, they first had to get through an impressive series of military works, which were constantly strengthened over the years. Between the bastions was a mound of earth called a tenaille. In front of it was a triangular fortification, the Half Moon. The bastions themselves were protected by other lower walls. Facing those was a covered path with soldiers and surrounded by 2 ditches. And finally, at the tip were posted advanced works called lunettes. And as if that weren't enough, each structure was surrounded by water, which made the attack even more complicated.
In the event of a siege, all ditches were flooded, and to access the various advanced structures, one had to either take a small boat or go over a wooden footbridge that could be destroyed quite easily once the defense troops had retreated to the interior of the fortress.
What looked like a beautiful rosette on paper was in fact nothing but a death trap.
A siege in a citadel is an obstacle course. There's a first step, then a second, a third, and a fourth, each being harder than the last.
Finally, in front of all these fortified lines was a completely empty space. It was the ultimate defense against enemies of all kinds.
It was a matter of defending the city, but also easily suppressing a potential citizen uprising.
Between the citadel and the city, Vauban created what's called an esplanade, a completely open area, so that any rebellious locals wanting to take up arms and seize the king's fortress could be shot down with cannons from the two bastions facing the city.
One of the bastions also had an elevated mound of earth to better cannonade Lille if the need arose.
It was facing the old town, the Spanish city that had just been taken. From there, they could install cannons, kind of like a gun pointed at the city.
Without a doubt, the fortress was well protected. But to resist the enemy sustainably, it was still necessary to be able to hold a siege. Again, Vauban thought of everything. First, weapons were needed, so Vauban had an impressive arsenal built, spread over several buildings. There was room to store 18,000 rifles and 34 cannon platforms. It was completed by a gunpowder magazine as massive as a bunker. Then, large numbers of soldiers needed accommodations. More than 200 barracks were dedicated to the troops, spread over 12 imposing buildings, to which the housing of the officers had to be added.
There was enough room to accommodate 2,500 men. These building dimensions were greater than their predecessors, where there was enough room in citadels to house one regiment of 1,200 men, but not necessarily more.
All of these buildings were arranged in the form of streets, squares, and quarters. And to keep the garrison lively, everything was available: a barber, a brewery, and even a prison.
Citadel comes from cittadella, meaning small town. It's the Italian word for it. So this little town is a military town, but it runs like a village. In the middle was the chapel, a daily gathering place for soldiers. It was topped by a bell tower with a bell and a clock to regulate people's daily lives.
To live independently, this small town had wells, water troughs, and fountains. Still present today in tunnels 10 meters underground are a meat oven and bread ovens that were used to feed the garrison.
It was really the nerve center of everyday life, but especially in case of a siege, given that the system was able to feed 1,000 to 3,000 men, depending on the circumstances.
To be self-sufficient, Vauban went even further. Bread requires flour, and to make flour, one needs a mill.
There was the noria, with carts that brought up the grain through the hayloft window that you can see behind me before it went down to the millstones.
To turn the millstones, water is needed to operate a paddle wheel. To that end, Vauban used the canal he had set up under the citadel. This canal was therefore the most vital element of the fortress. It provided the citadel with drinking water, gave it the ability to make flour, to evacuate sewage, and when it was blocked, to flood its surroundings. Much like the fortifications, it helped make the citadel a masterpiece of military art.
The citadel of Lille could serve as a reference and model for other citadels that were later built elsewhere in Europe and around the world. The perfection of the layout, the intrinsic beauty of the buildings, the implementation and the ornamentation of the doors really make the citadel of Lille something exceptional.
Whether by chance or proof of the ingenuity of its design, 3.5 centuries after its construction, the citadel of Lille still houses a core of 900 men. And the people of Lille like to walk among its beautifully preserved ramparts surrounded by greenery. But it is not the only must-see location in Lille. A few hundred meters away, close to the multicolored and elaborate facades of Old Lille, in the middle of the city's main square, is the Vieille Bourse. Although it was built only 15 years before the citadel, it radically departs from it through the finesse of its structure and the exuberance of its decoration. But however familiar it may be to the people of Lille who walk by every day, its walls still retain many secrets. Where does the harmony of the building's proportions come from? What little-known rules did the builders follow to create such a beautiful and balanced place? What is under the floor of the Vieille Bourse? And why is there such an extensive network of cellars? Why is it so richly decorated with sculptures? And how were they achieved? But first and foremost, why was it built precisely here in 1652?
It's the place for fairs and markets. It's the place for trade and gatherings, for civil life, political life, and commercial life. That was the case originally, and it's still the same today.
At that time, the city wasn't yet French, as it belonged to the Spanish Netherlands. The region was extremely prosperous, and Lille stood as one of the main trading centers. While other cities, such as Antwerp, had long had a stock exchange, this wasn't yet the case in Lille. The traders asked for one to be built, and the city architect was tasked with designing a project that lived up to Lille's ambitions.
When Julien d'Estrées built the Vieille Bourse, his plan was to bring modernity to the city. The city was rich. A program had to be created to bring it out of the Middle Ages.
It was a place of prestige that had to reflect both the wealth of the merchants, the wealth of the city, and that of the former Spanish Netherlands.
In this medieval town, still largely occupied by wooden houses, the construction choices for the Vieille Bourse represented a revolution.
D'Estrées wanted to create a rock-solid building, entirely with the most modern means and the most modern decorations of the time. It was a prototype, in a way, of brick and stone architecture that would then flourish throughout the city.
But what form to give to this new building? What type of architecture would mark its time while allowing traders to carry out their transactions in peace?
What's obvious is that there's an open central courtyard surrounded by porticos. This plan takes up that of the Bourse of Antwerp, which was built in 1531 and which went on to influence all the stock exchanges of the world.
Did Julien d'Estrées simply copy the Bourse of Antwerp to define the harmonious proportions of the building? When looking at the Vieille Bourse from the sky, one discovers a shape that's neither square nor quite rectangular. These symbolic dimensions refer to an ideal shape that has been forgotten, the golden rectangle.
The golden rectangle combines both an equilateral triangle and two sides, one small and one large, to form a rectangle of specific proportions. It's called golden because it's more perfect than an exact square, given that it's based on an equilateral triangle. It's a model that had been used since the Middle Ages and which Julien d'Estrées knew well.
This model can be found in many monuments, such as the Beauvais Cathedral and the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. It also fits perfectly with the design of the Vieille Bourse. But for Lille, this choice was not purely aesthetic. It was directly connected to the method used to finance the building. The city offered its 24 richest merchants to pay for the Vieille Bourse in exchange for a shop within its walls. The facade on the main square was preserved for them, while the interior courtyard was intended for traders. The choice of 24 patrons, which might appear random, was nothing but.
The number 24 is well known. It's found in the book of Revelation in the Bible, which mentions 24 thrones on which 24 elders sit. That's a perfect number. Why? Because 6 times 4 equals 24, which is the covenant of God and man. 6 is 2 times 3, so twice the Trinity triangle, which represents God, in a certain way spirituality, and the square that represents man. So there's a layering of spirituality and matter that's very interesting.
This funding trick had a decisive impact on the building's architecture, because the 24 merchants not only owned their shop, but also an entire section of the Vieille Bourse that went from the basement to the top floor. It all started in the cellar, which had a surprising use.
We're on the residential floor of the Vieille Bourse. It's paradoxical because we're in a cellar. The owner, the bourgeois, lived in the cellar equipped with a fireplace that was either paneled with wood or more often with earthenware, which gave a bourgeois look to the whole interior of the basement.
In fact, it's not only a cellar, but a network of cellars, which extends under the inner courtyard of the Vieille Bourse and also under the square. It's an unlikely maze of more than 100 vaults on which the building rests. Even more astounding, this network of cellars is surrounded by an underground street that goes all the way around the Vieille Bourse. It's no longer visible from the outside because it was covered on the surface by the floor of the square. But in the basement, remnants of masonry still bear witness to the past existence of this peculiar street.
To bring this basement to life, they had to capture the light and aerate the room abundantly. This basement window gives light to the windows you see here in detail with the sandstone facade. You can even see that the lintel that holds the floor of the living area has been significantly chamfered to make the passage of light even easier. The front door connects the beautiful, heated main room and the washrooms under the vaulted grand square, along with the sanitary facilities, laundry, and so on.
The excavation of these cellars gave rise to an imposing construction site, which one would never suspect by looking at the Vieille Bourse from the square. More than 10,000 cubic meters of earth were excavated to a depth of 5 meters, the level of the water table under the Lille soil.
You have to imagine this building resting on a raft of cellars. That's when the building sprung from the ground to create the Vieille Bourse you see now.
On the ground floor was the most important space for the merchant, the shop. It was accessible by a small stone bridge that spanned the underground street. On the first floor, the bourgeois had a very bright room with large windows, which was ideal for the meticulous work of employees, such as the lace makers. The second floor was often reserved for renting to the many travelers who participated in the fairs. Finally, the upper floor was intended either for the storage of goods or for servants. The Vieille Bourse was therefore an assembly of 24 quasi-identical sections of private buildings. The homogeneity of the complex is such that one might think it's a public building. That's also because the architect relied on the golden rectangle principle for the entire facade.
The golden rectangle that Julien d'Estrées had drawn in his plans was transposed to the building's vertical side to create the facades. That's how the volume of the Vieille Bourse was determined. This shape was used in the facades and the treves, but also in the details of the windows. Successive windows are double golden rectangles. They occur in the proportion of the small side as well as the big one. So these elements are quite magical because ultimately they all fit together particularly well to form the architecture.
But this wasn't the only reason for the regularity of the facade. It also arose from the technical constraints associated with the materials used.
Julien d'Estrées used local materials, notably with regard to the relatively short wooden beams, which are usually made of elm rather than oak, the former being the local wood. The span of a 30-centimeter section beam was about 4.5 meters.
It is therefore this 4.5-meter unit that can be found on all the sections of the Vieille Bourse. But the visual harmony of the building doesn't only stem from the dimensions. It's also due to the materials. The entire ground floor is made up of a row of dark sandstone, which seems to give the building its footing. This stone was chosen for its special qualities in terms of construction.
Sandstone is a rock that withstands shocks particularly well. For example, the shocks created by the wheels of a cart. But it's also a rock that's particularly resistant in case of fire, which is interesting. And above all, it's water resistant. Given that Lille was a swampy area, it's a material that was particularly appropriate for the ground floors of the city.
The rest of the facade features rows of white stone at each corner, cornice, and window edge, which perfectly coordinate with the red brick. Did it have a particular architectural interest?
The advantage of white stone is that it can be cut quite easily, so you can make tiles like a mikado that can slot into each other. This makes it easy to make frames, to structure the building, which then just has to be filled by brick or windows.
But this was only the visible part of the building's frame. To further strengthen its solidity, the architect added metal anchors at the end of each beam, which were attached to the stone on each side of the building and helped unify the entire structure. However, these metal parts aren't visible on the facade, unlike other buildings around it. So where are they?
They hid all the technical parts with architectural artifacts, decorated following the Renaissance style.
The metal anchors were hidden by sculptures in the form of the prominent stone ornaments that ultimately made the Vieille Bourse famous. But how did the stonemasons come up with the idea of such fine, varied motifs? What could be attributed to their overflowing creative imagination actually comes from highly codified sources.
They drew their inspiration from the architectural textbooks that were published at the time. Some models were identically reproduced. They took a model from a page, a second model from another page, and so on, before putting everything together to create their own decor.
When comparing the sculptures to their model, one notices the fidelity with which the sculptors respected the original drawings. Then what gave this chiseled stone jewel the look of joyful and exuberant decor?
Exuberance is created by using many motifs together. Whereas in Italy, for example, they would combine 2 or 3 elements. Here, 10 decorative elements were combined. The supports were interspersed with garlands of fruit and flowers. Some also took the form of men and women, so-called caryatids and telemons. There was also an alternation of curved pediments and triangular pediments above the windows. all in polychromy. This combination made a joyful and festive decor.
All these elements made the Vieille Bourse a masterpiece of Lille's architecture. The balance of proportions and the beauty of the decorations would forever mark the entire urban landscape.
The Vieille Bourse had an influence on the civil architecture of Lille. They started building rows of houses identical to each other, which were called Lille row houses or townhouses.
As a result, in the 18th century, visitors said that it was one of the most beautiful cities in the kingdom, given the harmony of this ensemble.
This glaring influence can be seen on Beauregard Row, an assembly of houses built only a few steps away some 35 years later. The visionary choices of architect Julien Descret thus helped to give Old Lille its now famous radiant and warm harmony. One kilometer away, and 2.5 centuries later, another building reinterpreted Flemish heritage and sculpted ornaments using a modern material, reinforced concrete. It is the town hall. Built in the interwar period, this concrete giant pierces the neighborhood thanks to its monumental proportions. "145 meters long, 45 meters wide, 3 floors that reach 30 meters, and a huge belfry that exceeds 100 meters in altitude. These are totally atypical dimensions for a building of this type.
It's a building of a certain architectural grandiloquence. It didn't just correspond to an administrative need.
Why build such an immense project in Lille in the aftermath of World War I? To better understand, we need to go back in time. The war had taken a heavy toll on the city, and the town hall had accidentally burned down. It needed to be rebuilt, but where and how? A neighborhood far from its original location was chosen, the Saint-Sauveur district.
This building was really destined to become a kind of bridgehead, a reorganization of the neighborhood and, by extension, the city.
This was an unsanitary working-class area. However, the town hall had passed into the hands of the socialists, who wanted to make a splash in the capital of the North.
The town hall had to be an emblem of the city, a landmark.
It was a political, ideological space, so to speak. That's where the left-wing anthem was written.
While the urban restructuring faded rather quickly, the town hall was built indeed. And to bring the colors of Lille to the forefront, the architect, Émile Dubuisson, designed an extraordinary building, blending the tradition of brick and the modernity of reinforced concrete, which he used profusely and left visible all over the building.
The Lille Town Hall is a glorification of concrete in every shape and form.
It was used for the structure of the building, the frame, in a way, to hold up the building. And at the same time, concrete was also widely used on the surface.
The best example of this extensive use of concrete is the large gallery that runs through the building from one end to the other. It reached the incredible length of 145 meters, the equivalent of 2 Boeing 747s back to back.
It's true that this atmosphere is closer to the skyscrapers of New York in the 1920s and 1930s, this kind of luxury, this magnitude of the spaces.
The idea of making a very large hall, similar to a train station hall, for example, shows the incorporation of ideas that were new for a town hall.
The idea was to manage the administration of the city with the most advanced methods of the time, inspired by banking, commerce, and industry. The large gallery streamlined the space, which served the various halls and services located on the sides, as well as the monumental staircases, thus avoiding mazes of corridors. But with its 7-meter height and 16-meter width, this huge covered street posed significant technical constraints.
This large gallery has a very wide span and very few intermediate support points. The Great Gallery, for example, relies on columns rather than walls.
To support the enormous weight of the upper floors of the building, Émile de Busson implanted 42 columns of reinforced concrete. This architectural technique had already proven itself over several centuries.
Émile de Buisson designed a building somewhat comparable to a cathedral, with a main nave through which one enters the building and travels through, along with parallel spans that allow access to other levels of service in these spaces.
Thanks to this technique, the architect could leave the ground floor completely clear. But he faced a new challenge: how to avoid giving the premises an industrial feel with all this visible concrete. To do so, he used tremendous creativity.
He developed a gigantic capital, which gave a specific optical appearance to the column that appeared more graceful thanks to this decorative effect.
These capitals are not only wide, but very finely decorated with floral motifs. Moreover, creating such a large, fluid, and precise decor required state-of-the-art reinforced concrete techniques.
1920 to 1930 was the height of the mastery of all these techniques of finishing concrete.
This was a time when reinforced concrete was the subject of a great deal of research.
While reinforced concrete wasn't a new material, Émile de Busson still demonstrated his incredible mastery of this building approach.
It was reported in the specialized press at the time as a performance, something that was quite special.
Indeed, to make these 42 capitals, it was necessary to pour the concrete into huge molds measuring 4 meters wide by nearly 7 meters high. A real challenge considering the lifting means available then.
They could have made cast iron molds, but they were too heavy and complicated to assemble.
There was a real problem with the implementation. Dubuisson's idea was to use molds made of aluminum, a material that's light and smooth.
It was still incredibly expensive to do so.
By creating 2-centimeter thick aluminum hulls, Émile de Busson had his technical solution. But he hadn't yet solved every single problem.
Aluminum tends to deform a little bit, so it wouldn't have been possible to make a sufficiently rigid mold in one piece.
The mold consisted of 8 parts. The main sections were the widest, and the secondary parts were a little narrower.
Aluminum molds made of 8 separate pieces were assembled at the top of the pillars of the gallery in order to cast the capitals. The operation took place in 2 phases. A clear liquid concrete was first sprayed using a cement cannon. It formed a film that, once solidified, would constitute the visible surface of the concrete. The inner part of the capital, which contained all the metal frame, was then filled with concrete and gravel. In all, only 3 whole aluminum molds were created for the entire site and were moved as work progressed on the 42 pillars of the gallery. Once unmolded, the concrete had an incredibly soft and silky surface, far from its traditional image.
This finish had a level of sophistication that was quite rare. The concrete was mixed with a kind of limestone that allowed for a very clean finish. They were able to obtain a surface that was very close to that of a traditional cut stone. But obviously, there are no joints whatsoever, resulting in complete continuity.
Thanks to this setup, the gallery displayed remarkable architectural homogeneity. Especially as in response to this concrete jungle, the architect had chosen to cover the floor with more than 2,000 square meters of marble, a considerable surface area for such a noble and expensive material. The result was that of a prestigious showcase of the northern city to its citizens. But the construction of the town hall led to yet another heroic prowess. At the end of the building, its huge belfry dominates the city and the surroundings with its height of 104 meters.
The main idea behind this building was clearly to establish a record for the tallest reinforced concrete tower of its day.
Weighing 9,000 tons, it's heavier than the Eiffel Tower.
The completion of this belfry was a genuine feat.
But why this desire to push the boundaries for a part of the building that was totally useless from an administrative point of view? While the belfry was a symbol of Flanders, where it had embodied the power of the town since the Middle Ages, the city, under socialist administration, wasn't merely trying to follow this tradition.
This municipal tower had to be higher than the symbol of capitalist power, so to speak, meaning the Chamber of Commerce.
But this choice was not without difficulty. Reinforced concrete is a heavy material, therefore requiring particularly strong foundations.
Lille lies on sandy, clay, alluvial fields. Given the large mass over a small space, they needed a soil that was extremely stable and deep.
When the ground isn't strong enough, the support points must be multiplied.
To ensure the stability of this gigantic tower, the architect deployed drastic measures.
They used a forest of concrete piles that were pushed deep into the ground in order to provide this new building with a sufficiently solid foundation.
No fewer than 210 reinforced concrete piles of 7 to 10 meters in length were planted in the ground. Over this stable structure was poured a 400 square meter concrete slab that was 75 centimeters thick. This foundation allowed the safe subsequent vertical build. But the extreme height of the belfry raised other questions.
In the context of the interwar period, many construction sites were run on the backs of men. Few modern tools existed. This explains the large number of wooden scaffolding used for this construction. The cranes couldn't go as high as they can today, so they were of relatively limited use.
How did they get the tremendous quantities of materials needed to build the belfry as high as they needed? It is estimated that over 3,000 cubic meters of reinforced concrete were poured into the entire structure, the equivalent of the volume of an Olympic-sized pool. Émile Dubuisson once again showed ingenuity.
The site featured a dedicated elevator. As the work progressed, it climbed in 9-meter increments.
On one hand, it allowed them to create a nucleus that stabilized the building. On the other hand, it allowed the materials to be transported.
But this device wasn't suited to bring up the most cumbersome elements, such as forms or metal frames.
Separate to that, there were a number of traditional lifting elements, such as winches, hoists, and so on, that allowed them to raise the iron pieces that didn't fit in the elevator.
Thanks to this set of technical tricks, in 1931, after 3 years of work, the belfry was finally finished. And even today, seeing the imposing reinforced concrete structure from the glass-walled elevator, one is reminded of the exceptional means deployed to raise this giant in the air. But the scale of the project wasn't limited to its size. It was also embodied in the perfection brought to the smallest details and the quality of the materials used.
It's a finish that can be found in cruise ships and department stores. In fact, it's quite similar to all luxury buildings of the era.
The architect once again demonstrated his skills as an exceptional designer and conductor, building a palace for the people.
Émile Dubuisson designed most of the elements, the furniture, the desks, and the seats. He designed the lighting and the patterns on the floor tiles.
The best craftsmen of the time paraded through the site, putting their know-how to use in every nook and cranny.
The washrooms were designed with extremely strong tiles, which are often curved at the baseboards to allow for easier cleaning. And if they're still in place today, it's because they were installed with great meticulosity.
The town hall is an extraordinary project in all its dimensions. The most implausible thing, however, is that only half of the original plan of this immense building was carried out in the interwar period. Due to political and economic problems, the work came to a halt, leaving the work of its creator unfinished.
This was Émile Dubuisson's masterpiece, seeing that he spent almost 3/4 of his life working on it.
It's a complete work, a comprehensive work. It's a work that was intended to be of universal value.
It wasn't until the early 1990s that new wings were added to the building, in a style far removed from the original one. However, almost a century after its construction, the town hall remains one of the most emblematic buildings in the city. As we take a closer look at the construction secrets of these extraordinary buildings, the entire history of Lille, from the oldest to the most recent, passes before our eyes. It's an architectural saga through which the incredible challenges taken on by men tell their own story. Through its lush decoration and its pursuit of a perfect shape, the Vieille Bourse recalls the economic power of merchants. Vauban's incredible defensive system and the extraordinary means deployed to build it display the strength of royal power. The concern for the grandiloquence of the town hall and the quest for a palace for the people glorify civil power. Looking up at the most beautiful buildings in Lille is a lesson in the history of an entire region, but also in the history of France.